So, without further ado, I hand over to Naila for a presentation.
Thank you very much, and I'm very pleased to be here. I've only started to be beginning to find out about your organization, so thank you for inviting me. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, okay. So, as we just heard, the Nobel Prize went to Esther Duflo, Abhijit Banerjee, and Michael Kremer on the grounds that this was a very pioneering methodology. But they were actually not being given a prize for a pioneering methodology. They were being given a prize for transforming the face of, mainstream development economics. In fact, it's now called the New Development Economics, and in many places, that's all they teach. They teach a whole economics that's based on the findings of various randomized controlled trials. So you can imagine why we find that a little bit troubling. What are RCTs? Well, when we used to do assessments, obviously any development intervention, if it's of a manageable kind, you need to assess whether it's working or not. And in the past, what you would do is you would take the people who had participated in that particular intervention, you would find a group of people who were similar to them in many ways, and then you would see who had done better. The problem with that, of course, is that, first of all, an intervention may be biased in terms of its location. It may be placed in an area which is somehow advantageous or disadvantageous. So there's a bias about location. And then the kinds of people who join an intervention may already be of a particular kind. They may be more innovative, they may be willing to take a risk, and so on. So you don't have any idea if the impacts that you find are due to the fact that they actually benefited from the intervention, or whether they're actually reflecting the fact that there are different kinds of people. So what RCTs do is, rather than what's called retrospective evaluation, they do prospective evaluation. They select a group of people that are supposed to be eligible for an intervention, and they randomly assign half of them, say, to the intervention and half of them to the control group. And because it's been done randomly, it is assumed that these people will be, because they were chosen to be very like each other, they will be very similar in the treatment group and in the control group, apart from the fact that one gets a treatment and one does not. So that issue of bias has been, according to some of them, eliminated, which means that any differences between them that we find in impacts can be attributed to their participation in the intervention, because we have now made sure that they're identical in every other way. So that is the claim of RCTs, and obviously, it's been welcomed in many ways, because there is a real question of selection bias. There is a question of, the people who stay on in a microfinance program are probably more entrepreneurial anyway, and that's why they survive. So by doing it ex ante, by doing it ahead of time, you try and make sure that you can, identify exactly what are the reasons why some people may or may not benefit. So it's raised the standard of evidence, the kind of evidence that you're willing to accept. And from that point of view, it's been welcomed as being more rigorous. And the other thing, of course, and here I feel very much in sympathy with the randomized people, RCT people, because it's encouraged economists to go out into the field, rather than rely on these huge data sets like the Living Standards Measurement Survey and so on, data sets that are collected for other reasons, and then people earned a living by crunching those numbers. And now you actually have to go out into the field and you have to design a survey that asks the questions that you want to answer. So from that point of view, it's been welcomed by many people. But so what is the problem? Well, as Nat said, there are the problems of ethics. There's a new symposium in the World Development Journal, which all short pieces, people complaining or praising RCTs. And one of them has actually, Nina Hoffman, has gone through a systematic review of RCTs. And she's found that the vast majority of them do not discuss whether participants in these interventions were informed or consented. And if they were even aware that they were a part of a participant experiment, they were much more likely to be in the global, they were not likely to be in the global south. So RCTs have become a way in which very privileged lecturers from the north and privileged lecturers from the south get together with their students and go and do little trials all around the world on quite poor people who may not know what's going on. And some of these trials are, of course, withholding benefits from people in order to test. So there's a whole set of issues, and you can get around some of them. You can say, okay, we're going to roll out this RCT, we're going to roll out this program, and in the rolling out, we will do that randomly, but in the end, everyone will get access to the program. So you might be able to get around it somehow. But very often what an RCT does, and the ones that we looked at, is they go, they experiment, and then they withdraw, right? So the whole bunch of people who never got any benefits and a whole bunch of people who did. And it does create, in addition, a lot of tensions. Then the issue is about internal validity. The claims to methodological rigor of RCTs is that through the randomization process, they have got rid of selection bias, right? By not giving people a chance of who is going to join and who is not going to join an intervention, they have got rid of any kind of possibility of self-selection bias and so on. But, that is possible to do in a laboratory where you can hold conditions constant and, manage things. When you go into the real world, people misbehave. They won't do what they're told. The two evaluate one RCT that I studied in Pakistan, they literally suppressed the truth about what happened because it wasn't randomized at all. Because the NGOs that were a part of it didn't understand the process. So half of them followed the lottery method to be random. The other half simply divided the people in half. And so you have no idea of what's going on. The same thing didn't happen in the other one, which I'm going to talk about. But there are many examples of what I call, project misbehavior. It's either project staff or people refuse to take up the resources that are being offered. Microfinance, they don't want any microfinance. People, they just won't behave properly. They won't behave as they're supposed to behave. And so this whole issue of being random starts to get compromised. And we can discuss some other examples of that. The other, of course, is you've done a little trial, right? And these trials are about 300 or 400 or 500 people because they're very expensive. They have to be just large enough to have enough power to, give you some significant statistics, but they're very expensive. So you do a little trial, but will it work somewhere else? So what you do is you replicate these trials in different parts of the world, and then if they all work, you say it's externally valid. But of course, you don't know what's working in different parts of the world. You don't know if it's worked here and it hasn't worked there. Nothing wrong with the actual program, but the people running it were different. One lot were very committed, another lot were not. How do you control for all of that? So there is an issue of how much can you generalize on the basis of the findings. And the two problems that I particularly have, I have problems with all of it, but the problem that I'm scaling up, you do a little experiment and then you say, okay, it works, we're going to scale it up. But when you're doing the experiment, you have all your attention on them, you have a lot of monitoring and surveillance and making sure people try not to misbehave. But when you're scaling it up, you're going to government, and the whole ballgame changes. You cannot expect government officials to behave as people involved in an RCT. So there's a whole political economy about how you scale things up, which you don't, necessarily have in the small scale, but you meet in the larger scale. Then the two other things is, because RCTs, a lot of them, and they're changing, I think, in response to criticism, but a lot of them assume, A, they randomize, so any effects that you find are due to the program, and B, the program is the effect, because everything else is the same. So if we know that if we find evidence of impact, we can attribute it to the program, we don't need to know anything else. So they don't actually collect contextual data, and they don't even collect how did that program work. How did the resources that the program is offering, how did those resources translate into any kind of impact or lack of impact that we might observe? So it's a very thin evidence base. And if you read any RCT, they're really quite boring, because all they do is they report on, a whole bunch of tables about the participants and treatment groups, and then they look at attrition effects, and then they report on the impacts. And there's no discussion or narrative about what the context was, why certain things happened, and so on. And then the final is they're extremely arrogant. They're extremely arrogant because they believe that this is the gold standard. and therefore no other evidence collected in any other way, cross-country regression analysis, small-scale qualitative data, none of that counts. It's all biased. And therefore, the only time they will, discuss any other evidence is on the basis of other RCTs. I'm just writing an article which is a rereading of an essay by Esther Duflo talking about women's empowerment and development. And the article jumps all over the place. And you don't know, how did you go from China to the US in the 19th century to, women's rights in, India, etc. The reason she can do that is because she's only talking about RCTs. So it's like, you've got this is the image I have of, there's a huge ground, and there are these pebbles, and she's making her way by just walking on the pebbles. But she's never walking on the ground. And so there's an incoherence to that essay, and you must read it for yourself to find out. So this dismissal means that all past knowledge is wiped clean. The only thing that matters is the RCT and other RCTs. Okay, so that's what's the problem. Okay, what I'm going to talk about in the very short time I have is completely by accident, actually it wasn't really an accident, and I'll tell you why not later, 2 evaluations were carried out of a very well-known targeting the Ultrapro program by BRAC. They were being piloted. And the targeting the Ultrapro program is targeted to very poor women, and it gives them a combination of small assets, livestock, goats, poultry, etc. It gives them training and very intensive mentoring by project staff. They visit them every day, they try and discuss their problems and so on. It gives them a consumption stipend for a period of 2 years of the program, so that they don't have to rush around trying to earn a living. They can look after the assets and turn them into an enterprise. And then they give some health support and they encourage savings. Okay? So it's a sort of multi-stranded program with asset transfers at the heart of it. And the idea is, within a period of 2 to 3 years, you will help people in extreme poverty to climb into moderate poverty. Right? So it's not going to get you out of poverty, but it'll go from extreme to moderate. Now, as it happened, and so I was doing one in Pakistan, I'm going to talk about Bangladesh, West Bengal one. But not complete coincidence, but 2 evaluations of these pilots, different pilots, but of the same program, were carried out. So one was an RCT, and it was Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee and, that gang. And they basically went about it in the way you would. They chose about 991 households who were eligible according to program criteria. They assigned about 52% of them to the treatment group and the rest to the control group. And then they were going to see, over a period of time, how did the treatment group who got all these assets and consumption stipends, how did they fare in the period of 2 years, 4 years, and so on, compared to the control group who were identical to them. And here's when the misbehavior started to happen, that the treatment group, those who were being offered the assets, half of them refused to take the assets. This is in West Bengal, and it's India, and as we know, India's diversity, caste, religion, and so on. And West Bengal has a higher percentage of Muslims than any other state in India. The people who refused to take the assets, free lunch, right? It's a free lunch, were Muslims. And they refused to take it, and we can also speculate why later. They refused to take it because they believed that these people were trying to convert them. And they were very suspicious of their motives. But what it meant was that you have a treatment group and a control group, and half of the treatment group are not being treated. But in order, the RCT methodology means, okay, we allow for the fact they're not being treated, but we will still measure impacts and average the impacts across whether you're, if you're a part of the treatment group, whether you were treated or not. Okay? So it's called the intent to treat. You wanted to treat them, it's not your problem that they refused to be treated. You're going to average the impacts across all of them. So the RCT found very positive, mainly. They found, at the end of the survey, there was a rise in assets, as you would expect if they were given the assets. There was a rise in income and consumption, and, they were getting income now from a number of different sources, both livestock but also wage labor. But they didn't find much of impact on some of the social indicators. So while women, one of their favorite indicators of impact is self-reported happiness. So while the women reported happiness, more happy, they were not empowered, according to decision making, and a lot of political involvement. There was no political involvement. There was no change in health status. Okay, so on the economic front, the RCT did quite well. The program did well, but not on the other. So this was our qualitative research, and we were down the road, 150 kilometers away, and we worked with a international NGO called Tricolor, who worked with a local partner called Human Development Center. And Tricolor did not want to do an RCT. They didn't like the idea of RCT, they didn't want to do an RCT, so we got them, okay? So they selected 300 women to whom to give these. All the 300 got asset transfers and all of that. We worked with the staff and we followed 20 of these women over a whole period of a year. We visited each of these women 6 times, and each interview was about an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. So we were actually asking them what their lives were like, what difference the program had made. So we were capturing change in real time as it happened. So 1 month we would go and, lots of goats, and the next month we would go and the goats had been destroyed. So we were actually capturing things as it unfolded. But at the very end, we asked them if they were on a ladder, did they think they were still where they were at the bottom, or had they climbed, and so on. And we recognize, of course, that it is a very subjective assessment, but it gave us some idea about whether they thought that their lives had improved and why, what their explanations were. Now, what I'd like to say and sort of conclude, how many minutes do I have?
You've got another 10 minutes.
Okay. So what I'd like to do is sort of why I believe in mixed methodology, why I believe in methodological pluralism, is because I really think no one method is much good on its own. It's good at what it does, but it's not good at anything else. And I think, given that a lot of this work is being done in parts of the world that we do not yet understand, where we don't have the kind of research that's been done in the UK. I mean, I lived in Sweden for a year, and they have a little blue book, and they have statistics on every aspect of Swedish life. They are really au fait with all aspects of Swedish life. You go to parts of Africa and India, and nobody knows. So now you're coming with an RCT that tells you just, treatment group, control group. So I think, at least in this particular place, they would have benefited a lot if we had done it together. So, what is the potential? Let's forget RCTs for a minute, but the potential for collaboration between quantitative and qualitative. First of all, the distribution issue. See, RCTs are interested in average impacts. How did the treatment group on average compare to the control group, right? Now, within that average, as we know, there can be quite a distribution. Now, let's forget the control group. Let's look at the treatment group. Here we have a treatment group where half the people didn't get treated, but you're still averaging across them. And the difference between them is revealed by one estimate they give us. If you average across the entire treatment group, you see a 25%, if you average across the entire treatment group, you see a 15% increase in income. But if you do it only for the people who are treated, it's a 25%. So by averaging, you've lowered the impact, but you've also concealed the fact that only half of the people actually got any impact. So the only kind of distributions RCTs tend to look at is by quartiles, looking at how the distribution varies by your situation in terms of income and so on. But in a place like South Asia, looking at income is simply not enough. You have to look at identity. You have to look at caste. You have to look at, gender. You have to look at all these other issues that are going to drive the distribution of impacts. And remember that this is a religious minority. You are running an RCT and you want to scale it up in a program which the Muslims are refusing to participate in, right? The Muslims participated in our one, so obviously it was nothing to do with the RCT, with the program. It had something else. And I think it had to do with the organization that ran the RCT, which was a big microfinance organization, Whereas the organization that ran ours was based on self-help groups, and therefore much more touchy-feely and willing to explain and all of that. So the Muslims did. Now what we found, so if they had actually, and here's the other thing that really annoyed me, because I spent hours trying to find it, I wanted to know, in the treatment group, what did the Muslims, how did they compare with the Hindus? Nowhere do they tell us that, nowhere. They don't even tell us what percentage of the treatment group were Muslims and what percentage were of the control group. So it's like they give you a lot of tables, but they conceal a vital piece of information. Now, in our case, we found that unexpectedly, the very poorest and the most marginalized benefited most. The Adivasis, the tribal people. And they are the bottom of the pile, right? And the Muslims benefited least. And we can come to that in a minute because it's a part of the explanation of the mechanisms, how change happens. But that is what we found. And of course, village location also made a difference. And I've lost my... Okay. The second is, so they don't pay any attention to distribution. Second, they don't know how to interpret the impacts. The RCT selected indicators that reflected the program's theory of change. Assets, livelihoods, health status, women's empowerment, etc. But the moment things didn't go according to plan, they didn't know what was going on. So they did find that food security and nutritional status had improved. And you can interpret that, assets. But, if women say they're happier, well, why wouldn't they be happier? You've just given them a whole bunch of free goats. You've given them money for 2.5 years. Why would they not be happier? What are you going to do with that information? Our study could give you some answers. And what it could tell you is, what does food security mean? What does increase mean for the very poor? It means that they don't have to skip meals. It means that their children are not crying because the people next door are eating and they're not eating. It means that they don't have to go and beg for food. It means all kinds of things, which is not just about your stomach. It's about your dignity. And as for self-reported happiness, the conversations that we had was the extent to which the program released them from very harsh and humiliating forms of work, in the field, harsh and humiliating forms of debt. So you've got these indicators and you don't know what they mean. And I think the qualitative research, and these indicators are used across the world, they're context independent. So self-reported happiness in Haiti may mean a very different thing from self-reported happiness in West Bengal. But you have no idea because you don't know what they're happy about. And and actually what I found very interesting about the women is the joy of possession. You can think of it as materialist, but actually owning something, owning your own goats, can be a source of deep satisfaction. And finally, of course, mechanisms. They were able to explain that there was an improvement in nutrition because, there were more trees around and because people had more assets. When they talked about women's happiness, they said, well, it's probably because of training. But you're not in the business to say it's probably because of that. Either you know or you don't know. Why are they happy? But you can't speculate because what's the point? What's the point of going and trying to find out what's going on if all you can do is say, well, it's probably because. And you're saying probably because you never bothered to find out why it happened. And as for where they found no impact, they don't even speculate at all. So they don't touch women's empowerment. In fact, they dropped the women's empowerment indicator after the first round. They never had it again. The health stuff, they have no idea why there was no health impact. Nothing. Now, we were able to explain the distribution. Why did the very poorest do best? Because in the past, they had been neglected. Every single program by the government and NGOs had left out the tribals, right? So for them, this was like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and they followed advice, and they did everything as they were told. But they also had more experience, and they've been working from childhood, almost from the day they were born. So they were very accustomed to managing livelihoods, being in the market, all of these things. Very quickly they sold off the sheep that they were given and bought pigs because they were used to rearing pigs. They were looked down on for rearing pigs. The Muslims don't like it, the high-caste Hindus don't like it, but they like it. And, so they had all the resources and the human capital through the sheer hard work that they had been doing over the years. And why did the Muslims do badly? First of all, speaking as a Muslim, they had all these problems about letting women going out, I'm not going to take interest, interest is haram, and won't do this, won't do that. So there were a lot of restrictions, religious restrictions, that curtailed the agency of women and curtailed the ability of the family. But there was one other thing. Because they are a large voting bloc in West Bengal, the state, provides a lot of benefits. The state ignores the Adivasis, they're just 5% of the population, but the Muslims are 27% and even higher. So Muslims get a lot of attention from politicians because of the voting power. And so they didn't need this program as much as the poorest of the Adivasis. And when you talk about livelihood diversification, that is in some ways a very bland word. We use it a lot in development, livelihood diversification. You talk to these people, and what does it mean? It means you use every bit of space you have to grow something. You dig whatever you can and have fish. You plant a pumpkin on your roof. You buy rice when the price is low and you sell it or consume it when the price is high. They learned all these things, which in the past, they didn't have the knowledge, they didn't have the mental space, they just were not able to. So livelihood diversification at that level is about making use of every bit of resource that you might have at your disposal. Every social network, you rear other people's cows, etc., etc. So it is the question is, why weren't they doing this before? They said, how can you plan when you have nothing? How can you plan for the future when you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow? So there's a whole kind of mindset and so on, which having that consumption stipend and having those assets made a difference.
Just another few minutes.
Okay, I've lost this thing again. Okay, no, I want to go back. Okay, so I just want to end with what I think were two important takeaways, one on methodology and one on the program itself. Methodology is what I said earlier. I think Howard White and other people talk about theory-based evaluation. You need theories. As somebody said, you need causal theories to explain causality. To try and explain causality by simply comparing, treatment and control groups is not enough. And you need to examine how a program works. It's not enough to treat the program as a black box. You need to know who was doing what, how they were doing it, and why did this program work so well with getting these Adivasis, to prosper in one part of West Bengal and completely. You need to know those things if you want to now try to scale it up. You can't scale it up without understanding what went right and what went wrong. So you need a theory-based impact evaluation approach, and you need to bring in all the knowledge you can about that context and to understand that context, and you need to ask people what's going on. You need their voices, you need their explanations as a part of your larger research. And that for me is a real, it's a fundamental belief. I just think you can't do it otherwise, or you can do it in a very lazy way. The other thing is, what is this program about? This program has now been replicated across the world. From Haiti to Ethiopia to Ghana, it's rolling out in Cambodia. It's become big. And in Bangladesh, where it began, it's worked quite well. People have reported some degree of progress. I think if I look back on our findings, and we went back, we were doing this in 2011, we went back in 2018 and visited those 20 women, but we didn't find all of them. And what we took away is what lasted from that. The goats and sheep had all gone. They died or sold off. Everybody had progressed because West Bengal has progressed. So there was a broader, air of progression and people are doing better. So here is a program that's trying to tackle extreme poverty without tackling structural constraints. That's very ambitious, you know. I think what it managed to do for the people who were able to benefit, and even those weren't, is it was like for 2 years, they were given hands-on, practice-based training. What they learned, they would not have learned so well without those assets, without the sheep and the goats and the fish and so on, right? But just giving them those assets without letting them learn and find their way into a better livelihood would also have been useless. So I think what I took away from it is for 2.5 years, you worked intensively with people through training them through actually the ownership of assets, of farming and learning new things and so on. It may not be the cheapest way of doing it, It was an effective way of doing it, but whether it can be scaled up is another question, because the level of attention that our program gave people, you will not see that on a scaled up version. So I wanted to end just giving you some of the references, and there's a nice little documentary. So I've written a paper for purposes of teaching. It's written in a way that it tells you what the RCT did, it tells you what we did, it tells you why our method was not very good for longer term impacts. We hadn't planned it, but I'm not sure that the RCT actually told us that much. And that's it.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful look at both the methodology and some of the human stories behind the RCTs. And now Steve is going to say a few comments for as much as 10 minutes, and then we'll open up for your comments and questions. Over to Steve.
Thank you very much. Well, although I've been a development economist, I've not been doing all that much on evaluation, but I have got my personal experience of working in the field. And I don't disagree with anything you're saying about the value of the multidisciplinary approach and the need for both RCT, if it can solve its ethical problems, and if it can manage to actually truly be randomised, it has a contribution to make. But it does strike me as being very difficult to achieve anything like that on the field, so I agree with you there. I have seen some work done on what I might call the anthropological approach to evaluation of, and I think it does give a quality of feedback which it may not be statistically as valid, but it does have a depth of understanding which the more statistically oriented surveys just cannot hope to do, and I've seen that in practice. How much a difference it makes. And I certainly take on board what you're saying about the highly political nature, the highly individual nature of what's working on the ground and what isn't working on the ground. It has an awful lot to do with power structures and relationships and belief systems, and so I entirely agree with you on that, the need for that sort of that sort of understanding. I think it depends, looking at the whole approach of RCT, I think it depends what your actual goal is. Is it to have efficient aid, or is it to end poverty? Because if our goal is to end poverty, there's a whole different set of criteria of that come into play. If you want efficient aid, obviously evidence-based policy is a lot better than guesswork. And RCT is one approach to getting evidence. I think the anthropological approach is another very valid method of getting evidence. And what you certainly want to do is to evaluate and to monitor. So we have a goal of getting more efficient aid. That's fine. But actually, we're not going to end poverty like that. My experience is all that the primary causes of poverty aren't to be found at the grassroots. You need to look at the whole problem historically. When I was at university, we were reading things like How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Rodney, and there is a whole problem of people coming to the field now and thinking, well, this is how it always was. When actually what's happened, you go back to the 17th century, 18th century, and the plundering that went on in India in particular was phenomenal, but with the rest of the so-called third world. So the results was that we were not starting, if we start looking at 1900 or something like that, there wasn't the so-called level playing field. There'd been hundreds of years of use of force, of slavery, of imbalanced trade, that had distorted the distribution of resources and the power through the world. Now we see trade being rigged, we see a terrible destruction of the revenue base for third world countries, and that result from the enforcement of reduction of tariffs through the fact that multinationals have vast resources that can completely compete out of the off the face of the market. Any small startups that's taking place, and all that advantage you get from established industry. And of course, there is an education deficit, and so you get the problems that are getting towards the micro level of countries not having the education base in which to compete. But the overall effect is that poverty is created as much by what's going on in the so-called developed world as what's going on or not going on in the poor countries. When I was at NEF, what my primary study was about was debt, and we did calculations about what would have happened if the debt hadn't taken place, or if the interest rates had been more reasonable, or if and the extent to which the debts were incurred in order to relieve the banks that had made the loans in the first place. So the commercial loans had been lent recklessly to poor countries. They were then bailed out by the World Bank and IMF when they hit a debt trap, but the people who benefited were the banks who had lent to these countries in the first place. And that's sort of market rigging. The effect on education systems, health systems and so on of the austerity that was imposed by the Washington Consensus, enormous effects. So when I think about eliminating poverty, I think you'll get far more effect by looking at the imbalances in power internationally, as you will looking at the local level. But you won't get anywhere on the ground unless you're looking at the power base within the country as well. That sums up what I say when I read
Perfect.
that.
Thank you very much, Steve. A round of applause for Steve as well. everyone's kind of a little bit bunched up on that side of the room. So if anyone who came in late, there are about 4 seats or so here. If anyone wants to come in a little bit closer, do you want to? Or are you happy there on the side? No one. Okay, well, leave you out there. If you change your mind, do just come in. So now we're going to take comments and questions. If you are making a comment, I will cut you off if you go on for more than about a minute or 2. If you want to just introduce yourself very briefly at the beginning, after 3 comments or questions, then the speakers will respond. So if you just want to raise your hands. So you've got one here, one the gentleman at the back, and then, okay, I've picked 3 men right away, so the next round is for the ladies. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you for the talk, it was really interesting. My name is Dravko and I'm working in health policy. So my question is for actually Professor Kabeer. So my understanding is that you're criticizing basically RCTs that we have used so far to inform our knowledge about how to drive positive economic developmental programs, but is your problem just with their design? Are you claiming that, for example, we can just design them better by taking into consideration of those qualitative methods? Because if we for example, account for and prepare a better theory of change by better understanding the context, or we can also include those kind of qualitative interviews and still make them randomized. So is it just blending more qualitative methods within the RCT, or is it totally abandoning RCTs? And in addition, if we try to understand better the context, prepare all those kind of theory of change, understand, for example, that what you were saying about the Muslim communities and that maybe they might not be the best fit for such kind of an experiment, etc. Don't we narrow down what then the question, and doesn't it then become really irrelevant what we're going to study?
Thank you. Thank you very much. The gentleman at the back.
Chris Todd, I teach in this establishment here, and I felt very much out on a limb recently because statistics seem to be so misused all the time. I have a friend who's a senior member of the British Statistical Society, I can't remember what it's called. She's a medical statistician, and she's continually fighting with Big Pharma because the statistics are so biased. So you have been rather, unfortunately, reinforcing my bias, and I'd like to hear from you what you think are the proper uses of statistics.
Hi, I'm an academic development economist at SOAS. Naila and I have had many conversations about RCT, so I wanted to push you a little bit into a couple of questions in relation to the rise of RCTs within mainstream economics. So first question is what you think the role of theory is among randomistas. I mean, how is it that they're taking theory? And I'm asking this because, one of the fiercest critics of the RCT rise is Angus Deaton, who happens to be a mainstream economist, and actually he was Esther Duflo supervisor. And that's one of the things, he's criticizing on many grounds, but he's particularly focused on the death of theory and the teaching of economic theory in economic structure, especially in the US. And that leads me to the second question, which is, isn't this a new phase of this tendency within mainstream economics to be essentially driven by method, usually single method? So we went through the cross-country regression methods applied to the understanding of economic growth in the 1990s, and that was a whole school that wasted a lot of money and so on and so forth. The same with other, optimizing, modeling behavior, etc. And now the RCTs, and that seems to be that tendency for the last 50, 60 years, whereas mainstream economics is basically driven by single method, and there would be another one afterwards, I guess.
Right, thank you very much. So you had a question on whether the problem is actually can we just improve the design and have more qualitative methods in there. Another question on statistics and are they just all biased, and what is the proper use of statistics? And a third question on what is the role of theory, and are RCTs basically just the latest fad that we'll all look upon in 10 years and say, what was that all about?
Okay.
Do you want to go first?
Yes, I think that's an interesting question. I don't think my criticism is just that they don't do enough qualitative. methods. I think there's a hubris about thinking that you can experiment on people and that they will behave, and that every single party to this experiment is going to behave in predictable ways in order that the randomization procedure, is perfect. And I think what Angus Deaton and others say is because they don't behave in that way, the people who do RCTs often end up trying to fix things. I'm not a statistician, but they do things like, what's it called, trimming. They'll get rid of outliers, and they do this and they do that. And they're doing just what other econometricians have been doing anyway. But they're glossing it up with something else. And they're doing it what other econometricians do anyways, because life is imperfect. But the RCTs are making claims that cannot be lived up to. I also have a problem about questions of consent. That so much of these RCTs, and therefore I'm asking myself, is there something inherent in an RCT that you don't want people to know that they are a part of an experiment? Okay, in old-fashioned evaluations, people knew. I've joined this program, and now you're trying to work out the data. So I have a question about: is there something inherent about RCTs that they do not want to contaminate the field by letting people know that they're part of an experiment? And I think this business of replicating RCTs across the world in order to get the big picture also doesn't work. Because there's so much to take into account that by the time you've done that, you're back in old-fashioned forms of evaluation. Okay? So I think it's more than... I think they could improve with more qualitative research, but I think there's some inherent problems with RCTs that can't be fixed. On the statistics, I'm a self-taught... I taught myself statistics. Because I never found the people who tried to teach me very helpful. Because if you ask them a question, they just say the same thing in a louder voice. That never helped. So I read a big fat book while I was in fieldwork, and I told them, and I have a great deal of respect for numbers. I like numbers. I like numbers that are well used and honestly collected, and its limitations are acknowledged. But I feel like it gives you a kind of... So I'm not at heart an anthropologist, because I love qualitative work, but somehow if you know that the distribution looks like this, and this percentage of people do this, and it just makes you feel, okay, I can now generalize, but I know the magnitudes of generalization. Okay, so what your friend is complaining about is the misuse of numbers. It's the, there's a new article that's come out, and it's called Lies, Damn Lies in an RCT. And it is about the extent to which this trimming and, not just statistical chicanery, but because nobody wanted the microfinance, they kept changing the design of the program. So they changed the village boundaries so they would get more people. They had quotas for women. They dropped the quotas because women don't ask for microfinance. They did all kinds of things. And so, but this is not reported. This is not reported in the official article. This we know in the way we know about the Muslims and all that stuff, because somebody else was there digging. Okay, but it's not reported by the people themselves.
Wonderful. Steve, did you have something to add?
Not very much. Obviously, if you're going to fiddle with the fringes of an RCT, then you don't have an RCT effectively. So, yes. Proper use of statistics. I too like numbers, but you have to be sceptical of what they mean, how they were collected, and what and you can use numbers, but they need to be treated with a certain element of caution. But I think we can't throw them out. Otherwise, we're not going to have any sort of evidence base for our policies. I'm keen on that. What you said at the end of the last bit about needing theory, I think you definitely need theory. Otherwise, you do you go down, and you just can't. If you don't have a theory about power in economics or political power in a country and between countries, then you're really working blind. So you're going to spend your time rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic rather
I
than.
think there's one other thing is theory helps you to generalize. So theory helps you take your results and generalize beyond the immediate results. So I think that's another value of what theory.
Very much so.
Okay, 3 more brief comments or questions. Please just raise your hand over here. Any?
I think it will have to be guys.
Any other women want to go ahead of the guys with their hands up at the moment? Well, you can. So, is it gentleman here? In the grey. So first, I'll say the gentleman here in the grey, and then the gentleman here.
Yeah. Thank you for your talk. It was really interesting. My name is Siva. I'm a PhD student in health economics at LSE.
Can you speak up a bit?
Yeah. Sorry.
Health economics.
Yeah, health economics. So my question is slightly different in the sense that it's taking the conversation in a slightly different direction, I think. So this is the second wave of randomization in economics, and the first one was very different. Whether it was better or worse is a different question, but it sort of took into account more contextual factors and it worked with governments much more so and so on. But it didn't become the methodology of all methodology the way it is right now. And so I wonder whether the rise that we have been seeing in academia recently is sort of the result of the fact that currently there's a large number of international NGOs who are willing to spend so much money on things like this, not necessarily just giving them straight to people, but sort of searching for more evidence-based aid. And also the publication culture in academia, because one RCT is normally designed in a way so that it can give you a maximum amount of papers, and it's a very efficient structure. So how has that contributed to the rise of RCT right now?
Great question, thank you.
Hi, I'm Liam Shaw, and I'm a master's student in development studies at LSE. Whenever I read RCT papers, especially with the graduation program, I feel it just leaves a lot more of puzzles than it sort of starts off with. And I think I've been delving into the realist philosophy quite recently, and it kind of echoes a lot of what you say and a lot of what critics say as well. The fact that we need to understand for whom it works and what circumstances and how and why. And I feel like the whole context, mechanism and outcome configuration is quite useful in understanding it. And I've seen a lot of calls for realist RCTs. And so I was wondering if you could shed some light on that, if you had any knowledge on it. And also whether the idea of this realist philosophy could fit in epistemologically in sort of what is development economics, because at the moment I see it a lot in global health, but not really in development economics. I was wondering if there's any space or any future for that.
Thank you.
My name is David Pilling. I'm a journalist with the Financial Times, so I'm not an academic. So I have a question, the premise of which may be a bit vague. So I wondered what you could say about the work of Jeffrey Sachs. It's my understanding that he kind of did what you might think of as massive RCTs, i.e. he set up, his theory, I think, was that, to put it, I'm sure too crudely, was that aid, widely defined, did work. The problem was it wasn't given in sufficient quantities to work. And so what he tried to do was to set up these model villages in several different countries, and that was kind of his RCT study. This went on for 10 years, and I think there were all sorts of problems. And I read his account of this in the Lancet. And after reading it, it seemed to be almost an admission that this thing hadn't worked. But I'd be just very interested to hear what you know of this project and what you think of the results.
Great, thank you. So we've got a question about the second wave of RCTs and possibly the idea that actually they're there to maximise the number of publications rather than actually improve aid potentially. Another question about how realist theory has influenced RCTs and whether realist RCTs are a good idea. And then one on Jeffrey Sachs's model villages and stopping poverty.
I think that first wave was not so much in the global south, as far as I know.
There were quite a lot of projects.
Okay, so the ones I read about...
Could you tell us historically, when is the first wave and when is the second wave?
Yes.
Well, we might be talking about different waves.
Well, as far as I'm aware,
Yeah.
there was a very interesting article which came out recently, and not all that glitters is gold, and it was
Yes,
like
yes.
a political economy.
I know that one.
Yeah.
Mm.
And so it discusses the first wave of randomization, which was mid-20th century.
Mm.
It was primarily driven by the U.S. government.
Mhm.
So people who were part of it were not sort of dependent on funding from third parties.
Mm-hmm.
They were just given a lot of money from the U.S. government for very long-term projects in developing countries as well, in the global south.
Okay,
yeah.
so I see those as and a lot of them were carried out in the US itself, and it was the US government. And I think, as you say, first, there was a kind of genuine interest, I think, about the US government, but I also remember them as being not as methodologically restricted. They seem to have been far more institutional, having much more of an institutional feel to them. But I couldn't swear to that. But I think what we're seeing now has narrowed and shortened the way things are done.
Yeah.
So I feel that there is a difference, and one of the reactions to the current wave of RCTs is the stuff by Lant Pritchett and others about how we learn from our mistakes. And RCTs, because they're short term, don't allow you to learn from your mistakes. Whereas I think the older ones, built in some possibility for adaptation. But, that's my reading of it, and I haven't... And the publication thing, I think it's not exactly... There are two things about publications. One is this whole issue of the publication bias, and the way in which so many people who don't believe in RCTs are having to do them because they're a part of the economics discipline, and because today a lot of economic journals, will not accept articles unless they are an RCTs. So people tell me privately, I don't believe in this stuff, but this is now what economics wants. But also I think in all that glitters, they also talk about, I wouldn't say a cabal, but there's been a takeover of certain journals by members of this cabal. And so how do, really bad articles get published? How do articles that don't fully tell you everything, how do they get published? Because they're all on the same journals, all the editorial boards of the same journals. So that's a small part of it. Someone has done a study to see whether the big journals, what percentage are RCTs. And I know World Development doesn't have that many. And it didn't look, I think we might be exaggerating it. So I think we need to do, on publication bias, I think we need to do a bit more homework on that. On the realist approach, I'm really not sure what that means, So I have two understandings of realist evaluation. And the one I think you're talking about is the Pawson and Tilley stuff. Is it? Yeah? But that's all about mechanisms. And it's all about context mechanisms and outcomes, which is exactly the opposite of the way RCTs are done. So if you start embedding RCTs into that kind of a realist approach, you would have to do RCTs very differently, and you'd still come up against that problem we talked about earlier. How much of the flaws of RCTs are inherent to RCTs, and how much are they just a kind of methodological interpretation? So I'm not sure how the two would go together. And on Jeffrey Sachs, I don't think he was doing an RCT. I think he was just doing one big experiment, of saturating villages with, various kinds of resources, and I think it has been acknowledged that much of it didn't work. And it wouldn't work because I don't know if he had a theory of what the problems were. I think he had perhaps quite a standard understanding that what these villagers lack are the resources. And actually, I think in the Poor Economics book, Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee position themselves between Jeffrey Sachs, on the one hand, saying aid is what you need, but just more of it, and is it William Easterly, who says, all this aid is very bad and the white man's burden and so on and so forth. So I think, in a sense, and actually to go back to your point, I think the RCTs also are a reaction to that kind of what they don't like, the big thinking, and that whole kind of aid fatigue that came in after 1989, and now we don't have to worry about the Cold War anymore, and now aid must be seen to be efficient and effective because there's no more political gains to be had by keeping people from revolutions. So I think it was also the post Cold War that gave these big donors the idea that aid has to be seen to be working. It's a particular political time, I think, as well.
Steve, do you have
not much to add.
I can jump in if you don't have something. So I will abuse my position of chair just to ask a question myself, and just to say on the Jeffrey Sachs. I was in Senegal working in UNESCO in about 2005, and I remember some of the other members of staff, Senegalese staff, kind of talking about this man who was coming in and he was going to stop poverty, and there was a lot of il va stopper la pauvreté. There was a lot of kind of chuckling and like, oh, of course he will, whatever, he's giving us money, why not, kind of thing. The question I wanted to ask was, how dominant are RCTs? So I worked in international development for 10 to 15 years, generally at much smaller NGOs, and didn't really come across them. But then I was listening to a Peter Singer podcast the other day, and he's a very big supporter of the effective altruism movement. And I believe that these are people who often go into very kind of well-paying jobs in order to give 40, 50, 60, 70% of their salary to charities, and they do it based on RCTs. But so how preeminent, we talked about it being the methodology of all methodologies. How dominant are RCTs would be my question. And then if there are sort of another couple of questions from the floor. I think the gentleman over there was going to ask before, and then is there anyone else who? Yeah, and then the lady here. Go ahead.
My question has two parts. So one is about, you spoke about the structural challenges for developing countries are facing, but from a policy perspective, a lot of governments, their challenge is one structure, but also domestic, right? I mean, policymakers have to decide how to spend their government budgets. And you spoke about the issue with RCTs being scaling up, but these incredibly in-depth anthropological studies, they can't be scaled up either.
They what?
They can't be scaled up either. I mean, the state can't send a team out to every single village to think about this. So, from the perspective of government officials in developing countries, what is the answer for them? How do they create efficient policy? How do they spend their money wisely? And then the other question was, my undergraduate in South Africa, and the university that I was at, JPAL, so it's the unit that Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee run, was at UCT. And our university, everyone spoke about RCTs as the best thing in the world, and I came here and everyone spoke about it as the worst thing in the world. And it was quite striking. It was about economic pluralism, and when you asked earlier on who thinks it's good, no one put their hand up, and who thinks it's bad, the hand shot up. Why do you think we've become so tribalized in our thinking? Why is it that in America we think in one way, and here we think completely differently, and there's no kind of heterogeneity in how we think? There seems to be this kind of tribalization of thought. Why do you think that's?
Could I ask you why some of the people, your peers in South Africa, would have thought the RCTs as so brilliant? I'd love to hear that.
We had a lot of micro behavioural economists at the university who who were doing work on that.
They were economists.
And who were pushing people. So I'm told they were forgetful money was coming into that. They were in that reality. But I think they also didn't believe that they were doing the work.
Yes.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, hi, I'm Tia. I'm doing a postgraduate degree at LSE in International Development, and it might be more directed to Professor Kabeer, but I was sort of wondering, because we were talking towards the end about intimate partner violence related to microfinance, and how you saw that sort of changing over time, and would you think those kind of more...
It wasn't related to microfinance.
Oh, it wasn't?
No.
Oh, okay.
There was no microfinance going on here.
Oh, okay. Well then, I know you've done some other stuff
Yes,
on that as well, yeah. Generally sort of, and I know there have been some RCTs on how microfinance with also gender training components in Kenya, in South Africa as well, how that influenced intimate partner violence. If you think those sort of more relational aspects and power dynamics are able to be assessed in RCTs, or if you need a more qualitative additional component in order to, so that's one example, the other relational power dynamics as well.
So, I had a question on how dominant RCTs was. There was a question of whether other methodologies can be scaled up, and why have we become so binary and so tribal? And then, if I understood it, whether inter-partner violence and other kind of power dynamics can be assessed within an RCT, or whether that's just outside the scope of the methodology.
Are they dominant? Well, where I am, which is both in Bangladesh and in Britain, they are very dominant. And I think, DFID, really over the last 10 or 15 years has become very hooked on it. I think the World Bank is increasingly going in that direction. I think the economics departments across the world have become complete. I find it astounding that you can teach economics as a discipline based on RCTs, based on... So I feel overwhelmed by them. And, after I've finished this, I'm just leaving this field because it's just overwhelming. I got into it by accident because they wouldn't collaborate with us, and I wanted to know why not, But I feel like it's on such a roll, and that's why I think the Nobel Prize has been such a bad idea, that it's given a very, arrogant group of people the go-ahead to continue in this way. I mean, I would like to think, there are people, even on the graduation program, there's a guy called Jonathan Murdoch who worked in, did you do work there? In the Andhra one.
Yes, later on.
Later on, yes. So he was interesting because he actually wanted to know why that why that program didn't work. But I think he wanted to know because it didn't work. If it had worked, I don't know. But the fact is, in Andhra, people just sold off all their assets and went back to wage labor, which is not the way it was supposed to be. So I think he wanted to know. So, I feel it is quite dominant. That's my feeling about it, and I regret it hugely because I think there's something. People say to me, lots of young people are getting involved. And I think, yes, because they can go and play games. They can go into the field and they can play games with people's lives and experiment on them. And I was on the Swedish Research Council. I was an economist on the Swedish Research Council. I don't know how that happened. But one of the proposals, someone was asking for money from Swedish research, which would pay for the experiment, not just to study the experiment, but they wanted money to do little transfers and then study it. And I'm thinking, research funds should not be used for these kinds of experiments. But the economist there said, no, this is the way it's done, and no one else stood up. It's absorbing a lot of research funding, and I find that very problematic. So, tribalism. Why do you think?
I think, realistically, I went to a debate 2 weeks ago at LSE.
You would what?
I went to a debate 2 weeks ago at LSE, and it was between anthropologists and economists in the room, and no debate happened. and it was a 2-hour thing, and no debate happened.
When was that?
2 weeks ago. It was it was hosted by the International.
With Trish Ghatak and
yes,
yes.
Professor Kremer, and they just spoke over each other. And so I think that it happens in politics, but it happens in academia as well. We write to our own journals and to our own peers and to our own communities, and we sit in lecture halls like this. We all come with a preconceived idea of RCTs are bad, and we walk out with the idea of RCTs are bad, and there's no real debate about what are the positives, what are the negatives, how do you weigh these up. So I think we become insulated, and our thoughts then become insulated as well.
Well, this World Development Symposium has a lot of different contributions that are on both sides. But also what you have to realize, there are power imbalances in all of this. It's not as though the anthropologists are running the show. It's the economists, and now it's the randomistas who are running the show. So it's not, two tribes. It's one tribe trying to colonize the whole of development. So I'm not, I don't see it. I'm very willing to talk to people in RCT, for we bloody understood what I was trying to say to them. And the thing about scaling up anthropology, why should you have to do that? Why don't we do what this adaptive business says, is you experiment, you put out a program, and you study it as it unfolds, and you work out what's going on with it, and as it's going up to scale, you continue to study it. There's nothing that says, study for a short while and then it's scaled up. No, it's continuous. It's iterative. It's how we learned in the past. So I think the biggest tribalists are economists. Mm-hmm. Really, that professional suicide comment was a nice guy, not at all arrogant. And what was the third question?
About inter-partner violence and whether they can be treated in RCTs.
They might be able to study it, and I think they do. Whether they be able to explain it, I'm not sure. Because I don't think they have much of a theory about what leads to intimate partner violence. All they could say is, if we combine this program with that program, violence goes down. Or not. So I'm not sure. There is that stepping stone and those other things that have. But they don't, what I found very interesting.
Not the line that you mentioned earlier in your presentation.
And what I found very interesting about our one is the fact that these men changed their behavior.
Yeah.
But when I went back, some of them had gone. A lot of it is about drinking. There's a lot of drinking that goes on in the poorest Dalit tribal groups. And so.
Well, thank you. We're going to have to end any minute now, but the conversation can continue over wine in the next room, and then we're going to need to leave at 9:30. But before we do, love just any final thoughts from Steve, and then final thoughts from Naila, and then I'll say a few words.
Certainly, yes. No, my final thought is the award of the Nobel Prize to the RCT is a problem because it distracts from the elephant in the room, which is the power dynamics in the whole world of world economics, which is the real problem about causing poverty.
Thank you, Steve. Did you have any final thoughts? Well, it's been absolutely wonderful to have Naila and Steve with us, and all of you. I was struck very much by some of the human stories that you revealed, especially some of the domestic abuse and some of the sort of positive.